Without Haason, Reddick, and Fletcher Cox, can the Philadelphia Eagles defensive line be just as impactful in 2024? We'll get into it as we preview the edge and defensive tackle positions on Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on in, Eagles fans, to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. I'm Louis DiBiase, joined as always by Gino Camilleri. You can also find our work over at Bleacher Report. On today's edition of the show, we continue our positional previews with the defensive line. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. The sports continue. They continue to sports. We all want them, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everybody every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. The Eagles defensive line, Gino, still full of talent as it's been pretty much for decades at this point, right? You've got Josh Sweat, Bryce Huff, Nolan Smith, and Brandon Graham on the edge. You've got Jalen Carter on the inside, Jordan Davis, Milton Williams. You drafted Jalen Hunt in the third round. There is a lot of talent, but for the first time in a long time, there's a lot of question marks, right? I mean, there's a lot of potential. We've said this on the show before. A lot of potential, but not a lot of proven elite production. I don't want to say no proven production because Josh Sweat has a proven floor, as does Bryce Huff as a pass rusher, as does obviously Brandon Graham. But is any of them going to be someone good enough to replace Haason Reddick? Is Nolan Smith going to take that step as a first-round pick? Can Bryce Huff be an every down player, not just a pass rush specialist? Like, there's a lot of questions up front, and Howie Roseman is really betting. He's relying on these guys. He's definitely gambling more than I think in past years he's been willing to.
Going back to 2022, you saw the investment really hit its peak. You were arguably the best defensive line outside of the 85 Bears when it came to overall production, getting to the quarterback, creating pressure, sacks, QB hits, the whole nine. And then you go to 2023, still a very good unit, but the production wasn't there of 2022. It came back towards the average. What happened at the end of last year, though, is the one thing that they have to avoid once again. Now, I believe that the floor may be lower for this group, but the ceiling could be a lot higher for this group because you still have Josh Sweat there. And he was one of the two guys that you had as the main two pass rushers for you. Haason Reddick, he is traded. You sign Bryce Huff in a pseudo sign-in trade, essentially, and you got a 2026 pick for Haason Reddick, which I think a lot of fans would be upset about. But right now, looking at this group, sitting here close to July, it's still very impressive. And I believe Bryce Huff is signed to be a guy to have that instant impact that Haason Reddick brought to this team over the past couple years. Josh Sweat in a contract year. Can he continue to elevate his game to get to that production level, which you and I believe that he could get to? And then behind them, if those young kids in Nolan Smith and Jalen Hunt can burst onto the scene and give you some depth that you didn't really have last year outside of BG, who you still do have, the ceiling, I believe, for 5 or 6 of these guys to get those numbers over the 2023 numbers could happen, but they have to hit that ceiling in order for it to happen. But if they do hit the floor, you could guarantee that Josh Sweat is going to be a good to great pass rusher for you, down in and down out, who could still defend against the run. And Bryce Huff, at worst, is going to be an 8 to 12 sack guy for you. And you're hoping he hits those Haason Reddick type of numbers. And the big thing is, though, who's the closer? That's my biggest concern. Question. Who's the closer for this group now?
Because, Gino, like you said, there is still a lot of potential with this unit. Josh Sweat has more talent than almost any edge rusher in the league, and Bryce Huff has been consistently a top 3, top 5 pass rusher from efficiency metrics over the last few years. Nolan Smith is a first-round pick with a ton of speed and athleticism. Jalen Hunt was one of the most traitsy edge rushers in this past draft, and it's why he went higher than maybe some thought in the third round, because he's so raw. I mean, the kid was a former safety moving over to the edge. So there's a lot of potential, but Yeah, that's the big question is, I think honestly this unit's going to be more consistent than they were last year getting to the quarterback. I don't think they're going to disappear like in the second half of the year. The first half of the year they were still on a pretty solid sack pace, Gino, but I think this year they're going to be better when it comes to like strength and numbers. I think the rotation's going to be a lot better. But you're so right, like do they have the guy? Are one of these players going to emerge time and time again in the fourth quarter in the biggest plays like Haason Reddick did, because that was Haason, and all of these guys have done it in flashes at the college and NFL level, but nobody has done it to the consistent level that, a Haason Reddick has in the past, or a lot of your like past top edge rushers, Trent Cole, Brandon Graham in his prime. One of those guys has to emerge as that player.
Now, the thing is with Vic Fangio as your coordinator, how are these guys going to be asked to get after the quarterback? They're probably going to have to do more two-gapping type of principles where it's more read rather than straight react to the quarterback. But at the same time, they're going to have opportunities because Vic Fangio, he's creative up front. He's going to give these athletes clear lanes to the quarterback, and you add guys like Zach Bond and potentially a Patrick Johnson off the edge as more of these stand-up type of guys. And I'm intrigued, how can my guy Teron Jackson, a tweener type of player, fit into maybe a defense that's better suited for him?
Or Julian Aquara and Terrell Lewis. Like there's some other traitsy players they brought in this offseason as well that fit this defense.
That's what Howie Roseman focused on. He focused on getting these guys that were on the practice squad close to the edge of the 53, and they're going to have opportunities because we know up top who are going to be the 3 to 4 main guys. But after that, is Jalix Hunt going to be used more of an off-ball type of guy in his rookie season to focus more on his athleticism where he could cover out to the flat? Or is he going to be asked to rush the passer? And are you going to see him just putting his hand in the dirt and using his speed off the edge and have 2 fastballs just firing in and down out? Fangio is going to give them a better opportunity than what Matt Patricia and Sean Desai would have. And it's going to look a lot different than what Jonathan Gannon presented, where it was just those 4 down guys. You know exactly they're going to have a 7 tech standing up, probably a 5 tech right over the tackle, a 3 tech, and a 1 tech, and that's going to be it every single play. Now with Vic Fangio, you're going to see Josh Sweat as a stand-up guy at times, I believe, and you're just going to allow these guys to use their whole repertoire more than putting them into a box as just a pure pass rusher. They're going to be a defensive lineman that they're going to have to play multiple different positions over that front.
And I think you mentioned Josh Sweat. He's the one I'm really intrigued by because, of course, there's question marks surrounding a lot of these defensive linemen. On the interior, too, can Jordan Davis be an every down player that gets the quarterback consistently? Is Milton Williams going to finally have that breakout year? We've been calling him one of the more underrated defensive linemen for years now. Is he going to finally become a full-time player that can replace Fletcher Cox from a pass rush standpoint? On the edge, too, like can Bryce Huff be an every down player? Because, man, if he can, we know he can be an elite pass rusher. But Josh Sweat is, to me, one of the bigger dominoes on this team because throughout his career, Gino, he's taken a step every single year, but he's never taken the step, right? And then last year, it looked like he was doing that the first half of the season. He was on a career pace, and then he just fell off the face of the earth. And that was the year they asked him to do more than any other season. So this year, that is only going to be revved up even more. Like, I think the snap count will go down. I don't think he's going to play, 75% of the snaps in games like he did last year at one point. But the responsibility, like you mentioned, who's the closer? Josh Sweat has never been asked to be the guy in that way. This year, he might have to be that guy a lot more than in the past. And again, he disappeared last year. So he's the guy I'm very intrigued by, especially, too, because he's in a contract year. Like, it's make or break time for him. It's kind of like, are you an elite pass rusher or someone that just has elite flashes and you're more of that middle tier player? So he's a fascinating case.
Last year was probably the first time we saw him plateau in his career when it came to growth. And
Correct.
He still was productive in the first part of that season.
Very.
But like you had said, this team asked him to do more. And that message and things that we had heard coming out of NovaCare that they were not happy with that edge group.
Yeah.
We could be sitting here today, realistically, Lou, talking about Haason still being on the team and Josh Sweat being the one who was traded.
That's what I thought the outcome was going to be.
So he has to step up. He has to be the guy. Or there's players waiting in the wings that are going to get opportunities. The young Nolan Smith, I'm excited to see what he can bring going into this season with a full off season. He's added some mass to his frame. He's probably going to hold up better as a 3-down player moving into this year, as opposed to just being a second or third down pass rusher. And BG, at the end of the day, Lou, he's still going to give you 6 to 7 sacks in his 15th season.
Hey, his PFF numbers last year were still really good. His pass rush efficiency, according to Next Gen Stats, like BG still got it. As a fourth pass rusher, like you could do a whole lot worse. Like I'm glad they brought him in. This isn't your, token farewell tour. You know what I mean? In year 15, like he's going to be a good player still.
We've talked about this role like the Carlos Dunlap role almost, where it's that third down guy who
they wanted Robert Quinn to be in. It just
exactly. There's another one, or a Chris Long type of player where they come in
Chris Long's a great one.
They're
BG
super effective in their snaps, and
yeah.
I think BG is going to go out into the sunset, have a really good season. He's probably going to play like a kid out there, like a young rookie, and more than anything, having such a young group, but still having Brandon Graham, even though you don't have Fletcher Cox, that's going to be a great message, a great teaching point week in and week out to have him. I mean, snap to snap, Lou. How great is it going to be when Jalix Hunt comes off the field or Nolan Smith comes off the field? Maybe they made a great play or they made a mistake, and Brandon Graham can just put his arm around these guys and get in their ear and give them some hope and teach them these little ins and outs that you wouldn't get if you didn't have these veterans in the room. So it's a very good mix that they have for the first time. And I think they got to let the young pups off the leash, man. They got speed on the edge, and they got to let these guys just fly. Let them be Ferraris, put their foot on the gas, get upfield, and give these offensive tackles who might be a little more flat-footed. They might not be the best athletes in the world. Let these guys use those almost point guard, just two-way goes where they can just shimmy, shake, and get past these guys. I'm excited to see how they can produce going into the season, because what the fall off we saw at the end of last year was so out of character for the Philadelphia Eagles.
It was for so many different reasons.
That's one of the 3 pillars of being a Philadelphia Eagle. Your defensive line is going to dominate every single game, and they just weren't that the last month and a half of the season.
And there were so many reasons. I think there were issues with the defensive scheme going from Sean Desai to Matt Patricia. We know that with Haason Reddick, he wasn't happy with his role being dropped back in coverage a lot more. Yeah, Josh Sweat maybe just couldn't handle the extra load. Jalen Carter hit that rookie wall. Jordan Davis dealing with injuries. I mean, there were so many things. That's why Gino overall is a unit this year. Like, yes, they don't have Fletcher Cox anymore. They don't have Haason Reddick. But I think they're going to be a lot more consistent than last year. Maybe none of these guys do step up as the guy. Maybe it's just a committee approach. But as a whole, like strength in numbers, I think it's going to be a better position than it was last year from the start of the season to the end.
Well, you might not have to really find, quote unquote, the guy at edge. Because on the interior, there's a player who's already solidified himself as one of the top 3 guys at his position in the NFL.
And that's what we're going to do coming up next. Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Milton Williams, the big young 3 at defensive tackle. Will they take a step up in 2024? We'll get into it coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. As you guys know, we love sports. We love them so much that we never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games. In the sports, they're not sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever we want them. All we have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood this summer, like you do NFL futures. I mean, that's something I'm getting into right now. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everybody every day, all summer long. So all you got to do is head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Take the Philadelphia Phillies money line. Bet on Jalen Hurts to win MVP. FanDuel.com/lockedon. Start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Got to turn down the volume because of all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And Gino, I love the way that you closed off segment one because it's a great point. We're talking about like who's going to be the guy on the edge. Is there going to be one that replaces Haason Reddick? And maybe that's not a fair ask of Josh Sweat, Bryce Huff, Nolan Smith to be Haason Reddick was a top 5 pass rusher over the last 4 years. I mean, he's one of 3 guys to have double-digit sacks in 4 straight seasons. The dude was absolutely incredible. But you mentioned, you made a great point. They might not need one of them to be the guy, because they're going to have an elite defensive tackle on the interior that played at almost an Aaron Donald level the first half of the year. Then there was a rookie wall. But, Gino, if there's one thing I'm very confident in with this defensive front is that Jalen Carter is going to return to that first half of the year form, and he's going to be the guy on this defensive line.
It's funny that we have these conversations like on offensive line at left tackle where you've had 3 guys really play that position in the last 20 years or so. Let's talk about the 3-tech pass rushing interior defensive linemen. You go from a decade of dominance in Fletcher Cox, and that torch was passed the second he stepped foot in the NovaCare complex to Jalen Carter. Like you had said, the metrics, the film, the athleticism, it was all there. The strength to power, the freakiness of what Jalen Carter is, the blue chip aspect of him was put on full display to the NFL the last season. And now that Aaron Donald has retired, there's going to be a battle for that next guy up. And Jalen Carter, he's the guy, in my opinion, Lou. You build this, the discussion for Vic Fangio starts. All right, I have Jalen Carter. How am I building my defense around him? And then I'm figuring everything out.
And other offenses, Gino, are going to say, like when you talk about who's the guy in the Eagles defensive line, it's going to be Jalen Carter. An offense is going to say, of anybody on the Eagles defense, who do we have to stop from wrecking this ball?
Who do we have to double every game?
Yes, it's going to be number 98, and he's only going to help those edge rushers be the guy because he's going to garner all of the attention. It's so crazy, man. Like 2 weeks into the year last year, he was seeing more double teams in the first month of his NFL career than almost anybody in the league. I mean, that's incredible. That's
Outside
how impactful he was. Yes,
when you're talking about any player in that regard, even in a Fletcher Cox regard, like if we were saying he's just as good as Fletch was, who at the end of his career was still probably a top 25 player at his position, if not better. Jalen Carter, his ceiling, in my opinion, like Fletcher Cox is great, Lou. He's a Hall of Famer. He has a different build, a different frame. It's made for the more modern game where he's smaller, more compact, can get off the line quicker. It does have that Aaron Donald type of feel, and I don't want to disrespect Fletcher Cox at all. He's my
2018 Fletcher Cox could wreck games. But
I named my dog after the guy. For goodness sake.
Exactly.
But now, once you have a player who you know is going to take 2 blockers every single time, that's when Jordan Davis, Josh Sweat, Bryce Huff, those guys, all they have to do is win one-on-ones. That's what they're going to be asked to do. And that's why Jordan Davis, he better step up this season. Yeah. Because if he does get those one-on-ones because you have to go and you have to down block and have another guy on the opposite hip of Jalen Carter every single snap, well, Jordan Davis, you're going to have to overpower some of these smaller guards. You're going to have to take on a gap and a half, maybe even 2 gaps, and get after the quarterback if you are not reading or run. He has to step up in the biggest way. Huge. You talk about the biggest, maybe the most surefire player on this defensive line in Jalen Carter. The biggest question mark could be the player right next to him in Jordan Davis.
Yeah, and Gino, even if he doesn't be in again, we've said this on the show before, to justify the trade up for Jordan Davis a few years ago, he needs to be a really good pass rusher, in my opinion, a Dexter Lawrence type of player. However, he also just needs to stay healthy because at the worst, you need, especially with Fletcher Cox gone, and there's no Linval Joseph this year to help, or Ndamukong Suh. Like, you look at, I'll never say his name correctly, Jordan Davis, the floors, he's shown that he can, when he's healthy, he can be an elite 2-down nose, like, run stopper. Like, that's one thing, like, he's not a bust. He has shown he can be dominant in a certain area. But even that has been too far and few between because of the conditioning and the health. So he needs to stay, he's in the best shape of his life. I saw him in person at the Autism Challenge. Like, he looks like a different person, but it's always like week 8, week 9, week 10, 2 years in a row. That's when Jordan Davis has fallen off a cliff. So, yes, I want him to be the pass rusher that we're talking about, but he also this team needs him to stay healthy because look how bad their run defense was the second half of the year when he fell off the cliff. They went from one of the best in the league. Like, they were top 5, top 10 for the first half of the year, and then they were a bottom 5 team. Like, and that was so much because of, like, him. Like, they rely on him so much in that way. So that's
especially
important.
in his rookie season too. It was clear if you look at the splits in the run game versus when he was hurt and then when he came back from his injury, it was evident he was the best run stopping defensive lineman for you. Yeah. And the thing is, like you had said, at worst when he's healthy and he's on the field, he's going to be a guy that commands double teams as well in the run game. And
he had the highest run stop grade of any defensive tackle last year, the first half of the year.
And if he now has a newfound, let's say, endurance to his game and maybe like a quarter step faster by slimming down a little bit, he can really push the envelope at that second pass rusher position. Because if not, Lou, behind him you have Milton Williams, who's looking for a contract from some team, if not an extension from the Philadelphia Eagles. He's probably going to get paid a bag this offseason. Behind him, Marlon Tuipulotu is also coming towards the end of his Eagles tenure. Is he going to be the next guy up? You drafted Moro Jomo, who showed some flash last season. Is PJ Mustafa or Gabe Hall going to be that next guy up behind them? Who knows? But up top, we know how good these guys can be. And there's 4 deep here that are really going to be in this rotation, snap in and snap out. I believe Tuipulotu will probably be the next guy up behind Jordan Davis. They signed PJ Mustafa from, I believe, New Orleans to also compete for that position as well. But if Jordan Davis can play as well as you believe he can, there should be no need for those guys because he's going to be a 3-down football player, and him and Jalen Carter are going to command a majority of these snaps where you can say, oh, I have a luxury of a Milton Williams that I can figure out where to just get him in the best matchup in these one-on-ones, and you can have all of this fun up front. That
Milton's got a great opportunity, man. I mean, this is a year where he can prove he's a full-time player, and whether it's with Philly or another team, like he's going to finally. I mean, he's gotten hot at the end of the year at the right time and back-to-back seasons, but he's been buried on the depth chart so much that you've never really been able to consistently see who Milton Williams is. Like, I'm fascinated to see who that is now because this year, no matter what, even with Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter in front of him, he's going to have a much bigger role than he's had.
Oh, you'll see sets where, I mean, Jordan Davis will probably play a zero tech where he's directly in front of the center, and then you're going to play Milton as a 3 tech. You're going to play Jalen as a 3 tech where they can crash the B gaps between the center and the tackle, and then that's going to free up everything else to do these stunts with the edge rushers. You're going to see Milton Williams have all of the opportunity in the world this year to go and get that contract from somebody because he's shown that when he's on the field, Lou, he is one of those guys. I know we always say it every episode. He hits his corner threes. He showed up for you in some big time games.
And now can you be a full-time
run
player?
In the past. Yeah. Now can he be that full-time player?
Yeah, because sometimes
if Jordan
in the
Davis
NBA,
can he displace him? We'll see.
Exactly. Sometimes in the NBA, you ask the 6th man of the year to be a full-time starter, and they can't be that guy. So
J.R.
really
Smith never could do it, man.
Well, I mean, just look at Josh Sweat. I mean, he was a great 3 or 4 for years, taking the steps, became a 1 or a 2. Then he needed to be a 1. 1A, 1B, and he, we'll see. So it's not just Josh Sweat that has to answer that question this year. It's also Milton Williams, especially if Jordan Davis does not take that pass rush step in 2024. We'll wrap things up with over-unders as we look at stats for the defensive line coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, Gino. So the numbers last year for the defensive line, not nearly as good as they were in 2022. I mean, almost no team in NFL history had the numbers of the 2022
Yeah,
Eagles
you
defensive
can't
line.
compare many.
Only the
teams to that
Chicago
one.
Bears of the 80s. I mean, they almost broke the single season sack record. Last year, as you mentioned earlier, came back down to earth, 43 sacks. They were still at a pretty good pace this first half of the year. That number would have been a lot higher, but again, everything just went to hell the second half of the year. I think when it comes to like team totals in sacks, Gino, again, 43, I would take the over on that. Again, as a unit, as a strength in numbers group, edge, defensive tackle, I think they're going to have a much better year this season.
I personally believe right now you have an opportunity to get two guys above 10.
Yeah.
I think Jalen Carter is probably the favorite then between Bryce
then
Huff and Josh
Huff
Sweat.
or Sweat.
One of
You'd
those
hope
two.
one of them gets to it, or both have like 7.5 to 9.5. Like they better have both 7+.
So let's say you get to 20 between two players. Can the 8 or 9 other guys get 23? I personally believe that if they hit their ceiling,
Yeah.
50, maybe another 10 to that 43 could be it could be plausible because you have to put 2022 out of your mind. It's such a great it's an
historic.
outlier season in history. But what is average for the Eagles? We're 50 sacks a season. I think that's pretty surefire.
43 is very
every
low
year.
for this
Yep.
team, is what we're used to. And I think when you look at like Josh Sweat 6.5, I'd want the over on that for him this year. Milton Williams only had a half a sack. You would imagine he has over that this year. Jalen Carter at 6, I would take the over there.
Yep.
Fletcher Cox leaving with 5 sacks last season. Nicholas Morrow had 3, funny enough. Like, I imagine you make up those sack totals with Jordan Davis, who had 2.5. You look at Milton. You look at Bryce Huff coming in.
Some
and
of these
Haason,
off-ball guys
yes.
like Zach Bond will probably make up the difference.
Nolan Smith
Kobe
and Brandon
Dean, maybe.
Graham. Yeah, I mean, Nolan Smith and Brandon Graham, you imagine their totals will be higher. But Haason Reddick's the one that leaves with those 11 sacks. Like, they got to get a couple dudes in double digits to really make up for that.
So you're saying between Bryce Huff and Josh Sweat needs to up his by about 5 to just do it by himself. But with Bryce Huff, they should definitely eclipse that number. But between Josh Sweat and Haason Reddick, that's the bigger question.
Like Haason Reddick and Josh Sweat last year combined for 17.5 sacks. Would you take the over on that for Huff and Sweat combined?
Ooh, for Huff and Sweat?
Maybe not, but maybe with Nolan.
The top edge rusher and Carter, I'll take that over. But I'm not confident.
Okay, fair. Yeah, that's fine. If it's Carter, let's say it's Carter and Sweat, I would take the over there.
Okay, I'll take it with either of those two. I think Jalen Carter is going to give you a really high sack total this year, and
it'll be close
down to the season yet again.
And even if you're around that number, a little under compared to Reddick and Sweat last year, again, when you add up Davis, Milton Williams, Jordan Davis, Nolan Smith, Brandon Graham, I think they're going to have a much higher total than your other guys, because then you go to Carter and Cox, and outside of those two, you didn't have the sack numbers from your role players that you've had in recent years.
And BG, he should be good for another 6 or 7. We'll see what Jalix Hunt can do potentially in his rookie year. I think 3.5 could be a decent number for him. Moro Ijomo, if he gets more opportunities on the interior, I think he's somebody that could be a 2 or 3
Remember
sack
too,
guy
Gino,
on
if they
this
start
season.
blitzing linebackers more, like Nicholas Morrow had 3 last year, Devin White is somebody they're going to probably want to use in the blitz game. Like, that's another part of this equation.
So
well.
as a unit, I believe they
it's gotta be
have
over.
up top. I think it's even. Like, you could just kind of wash those guys out.
Agreed.
But the depth, the role players, those guys that are going to get more opportunities, are they going to step up, get to the quarterback? I think they have more athleticism than that group last year, and they're going to have more potential to hit home.
Do you think somebody surpasses Haason Reddick's lead of 11 sacks last year? Do you think Jalen Carter can get over 11? I think that would be incredible if he could get to 12 plus.
So what's Aaron Donald's most ever in a season? Pull that up, because I'd be intrigued.
I think he didn't reach 20, right?
Now, looking at Jalen Carter, you know he's going to take on
20.5 was Aaron Donald's career high.
20.5.
And
Can
then,
he
so
hit
let's go
half
to-
of that number?
So he had a season of 13.5, 2 years where he had 12.5, 2 years where he had 11. I think he could get to 11. I think Jalen Carter could
I think
tie
that's a
at
safe
least
bet.
Haason Reddick's total. If he takes that step, if the first half of the year Jalen Carter is what we get all year long, I would imagine he gets double-digit sacks.
more opportunities, a bigger step in leadership. Why not? Why can't he get 11 sacks? I mean, he has all the tools in his body, like Howie Roseman loves to say, to hit that number. And the pressure numbers have to take a jump yet again. You have to close in on these sack numbers. You got to create turnovers too. We talk about how important it is for the secondary to create turnovers. You have to create fumbles at the quarterback. That was one thing Haason Reddick did maybe better than anybody on this roster the last couple seasons.
Just
they
like the
have
NFC
to find
Championship.
somebody that can go and change the game in a blink of an eye.
It's another exciting unit with a lot of questions, but a lot of potential. And again, you even mentioned the depth, like Moro Ojomo. I'm really excited to watch Aquara and Terrell Lewis. And you mentioned, Taron Jackson and Patrick Johnson still on this roster.
Preseason's going to be fun for these
guys. It's the defense is going to be so. Defense over offense to me is what I'm watching all summer long because there's just so much youth, speed, and potential. So defensive line continues to be that way as well. We'll move over to the secondary and linebacker coming up this week as we continue our positional previews right here on Locked On Eagles. Thanks so much for making us your first listen each and every day. For Gino Camilleri, though, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off for now. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.